Okay, hi guys. My name's Rob. I think I'll hopefully introduce myself to a few of you guys, but those I haven't, I'll hopefully see in a moment. I'm Rob and...
This is Ryan.
I thought you forgot his name. That was rehearsed. So what we'd like to talk to you tonight about is our kind of use of BDD and how it's kind of evolved over the last 6 to 7 months, and then also how kind of what we're thinking about doing in the future and how we can change it up a little bit. So, quite a good place to start is a little bit about our process and how it kind of led us to sort of bring ourselves to sort of start doing a bit of BDD. So, we're going to talk a little bit about Agile and how we've kind of adopted that, and then the crux of the talk's going to be on our development workflow and obviously the BDD kind of aspects of that. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about, in the future, what we're going to try and do to bring our front-end and back-end approaches together. So, in terms of Agile, we've sort of been going Agile, have gone Agile, pretty much there, we think, for the last 12 months. Kind of following our own kind of approach, sort of based on a bits of Scrum and a bits of Kanban and things like that. But obviously, being Agile, the crux of it is user stories. So we're now developing everything we do is based on user story. And that was quite a sort of challenge getting my heads around how that works. In terms of like our team, we have, just like other digital agencies themselves tonight, we have pretty sort of defined responsibilities between everyone. I'm just going to do a quick shout out to who's in here, because I think it'd be good to mention it. So we've got Kirst at the back, who's a sort of management, product owner type guy. We've got Nat, who's a designer, who is next to you. You can see that. We've obviously got Ryan, who's front end dev, and myself. And we've got Eddie, who's just started this week, who is back there. And we've got Pete, who some of you might have met, who's actually sort of moved to Canada. But he's actually still working, and it's really good the way he kind of work like this. We're really sort of still as productive with him there. And we've also got Chris, who is at the back there, who's starting not Monday, but the week on Monday, I think. Yeah. Is that right? And he's in the back end team as well. So it's we've obviously got these defined roles. But what's interesting is like sort of working with user stories. We've found that we can pretty much come together quite a lot more than we used to. It's a bit more of a sort of a common starting point. And the way that we work is in Trello. And a user story goes into Trello. And the user story has design, front end and back end sort of put on it from day one, and we kind of work from that basis. So, how do we sort of discover BDD as it were? We put the acronym up there because we thought we should, but obviously I think hopefully it's pretty self-explanatory what it means. Now we actually started BDD kind of on the front end about a year ago. We kind of picked it up on some of the backbone and Accenture touch applications we were writing. And since that point, we've kind of moved it onto the back end. Really the tooling that kind of enabled us to sort of start with it. And since that point, we've kind of been doing it with our Symfony applications and our Silex applications. The interesting thing is, it was actually a developer-driven thing. We knew it was a good pattern to follow, unit testing, and we were thinking, should we do like TDD? But BDD was also kind of this thing that people were talking about. So, even though you'll probably see from this, hopefully, there's a lot of business benefits to it. It wasn't something that was like a business decision. It was definitely a developer-driven kind of choice to sort of work like this. But as I say, everything starts from a user story. So, regardless of those two front-end and back-end kind of routes that we go on a project, we'll always start from the user story in Trello. So what I want to do now is just talk a little bit about how it works on the back-end and kind of take you through a user story from start to finish and show you like the tools we're using and how that BDD kind of approach works. So on the back end, we're following this outside-in approach. Now, if you Google it, you might find outside-in BDD, but you might also see it known as full-stack BDD. It's this idea that you've got two kind of separate workflows. You've got this outer workflow, which is known as a story BDD type part, and then you've got the inner sort of stuff, which is spec BDD, which is this is very much what Lucas has been speaking about. This is the unit testing kind of the classic unit testing part. You read about outside in, you read about full stack, but it's essentially come from this book, the RSpec book, it's really born out of that, and this is in fact doctored from that book, this diagram. I've just put the Behat there, phpspec there. So the two tools we use is Behat and phpspec, and now I'm just going to demonstrate how those things work hand in hand with this outside-in kind of approach. So, do my Steve Jobs bit and sort of sit down here. Demo.
Straddle it.
Right. Okay. So here we are. So what I want to do is just want to take you through a kind of one user story and how that sort of works. So this is a panelsurveyor.com. This is a website we're working on at the moment, but it's live. We finished it in December, and this is a light bulb manufacturer, pretty big light bulb manufacturer, and one of the main parts of the application, one of the biggest sort of business value aspects, was a product finder. The product finder enables people to search for light bulbs by sort of characteristics and stuff like that and find the products that they're looking for. So we're going to do one example here, which is as a user, I can select a category of LED. Okay. What that does, that shows me a list of all the LED products. And I can filter by the shape candle. Right. So there we go. So all of those products disappeared. There's our candle. Now what this actually is, this is a backbone application, which is talking to a Symfony application in the background. So I'm a back-end guy, I wrote the web services, feed that. Ryan's on the front end, he wrote the backbone application, which kind of does all the UI. So hopefully that's... Ooh. So the starting point, let's try that. So as a customer, I can filter a list of product lines in order to find a product more easily. That was the sort of general business kind of requirement we got from the client. So our starting point is we have this user story, and then we refine it. We refine it in our teams. We come together, design front end and back end. We think about the kind of scenarios that would involve. We talk to the client. We find out that they've got different types of filters. So we've got LED, we've got HID, we've got external kind of lighting, all that sort of stuff. We flesh out these filters. And the important thing is this is totally collaborative, because it means that you kind of pick up on requirements that you might miss if you kind of do it as a developer on your own. Start here. And then we kind of kick off our BDD development approach. So we're on the outside at the moment. We're on this Behat story BDD workflow. And then we're defining... This is a Gherkin file, and what this is a human-readable, business-readable articulation of that user story. So, as a customer, I can filter a list of product lines by bulb shape in order to find a product more easily. That's our our basic business requirement. And those scenarios that we sort of had in our Trello card are here. So, scenario one is I will be shown bulb shape filters for a category. So that says when I select that category LED, I should see that bulb shape filter with some values. So I clicked on candle. So I need that filter to be there. So obviously that's driven by web services. So this is the first scenario. And our second scenario is then like I can filter product lines by bulb shape. So given that I've selected that category, when I then filter by candle, then I should see some products. So that's the sort of second sort of scenario we tackle. And that's pretty clear to us as developers. The point is we also articulate that, and anyone can understand that. Kirsten can understand that. Sort of product manager, the client can understand that. Now, at the moment, we don't really share these with the client, but I think where we're trying to go is that we would, if you've got a great client, the client can even write those for you. I think that's really what this approach is trying to kind of get to. So, again, we start there, and then we start testing that scenario. So this is Behat, and this is a step definition. So one of those actions, I have selected category. This is me implementing essentially a test to fulfill that. So I've tried to be a little bit sort of verbose here, just to get the guys that have seen a bit of Behat, give you a little bit of something to catch your eye. So I've got selected category, and obviously what we know is happening here is that we've got this is a web service. So I want to URL encode that filter that I'm putting there. So I've selected the category LED, so I always make sure that it's URL encoded. And then I'm setting up the route that I'm going to hit. So that might look like this. It's a URL path, right? Product search with that query string category LED. Okay. So this is me kind of using the Symfony routing and things like that, just to generate that URL. The important part is I have this line here, which is this get session visit URL. Now Behat's got a mechanism inside it which actually uses a browser to go off and make that web request and hit that URL. And then what you can do is you can assert that, for example, once that's been hit, that you've got 200, that page exists, for example. It's not thrown an error. The basic principle here is that we've got that feature file, and then we create this test to sort of prove that it works. That does two things. It proves that it's a reusable test, so it means that you can sort of run it lots of times to check you haven't broken the application. But the important bit is that as a developer, this is like my interpretation of that user requirement. The user requirement is I select category, but I'm actually implementing it as a web service call. On the front end, I select a category, you're actually clicking on a category. So your feature, your definition here might be slightly different because your priorities are different on the front end and the back end. So that's that part.
So do you have different scenarios?
Well,
okay.
I think I'll just let the cat bang. Sorry, mate. So then I run this, okay? I run this on my console, I run it on my machine, and I see like the readout. So the readout is actually, it's not like a normal readout, that's actually pretty useful. You can read that, you can see what's happened. I've got this scenario showing a list of bowl shapes. When I set that category LED, I should get a 200, but actually I'm getting 500. So that tells me I've got a problem here, and because I've just started, I probably haven't got a controller, I probably haven't got a route set up. Whatever happens, something's broken. So in exactly the same way that Lucas was saying, you've got this sort of approach where you get failing tests and then you kind of implement the code and you factor. This is exactly that mantra. You've got a failing test and you've got to go and do something else. The point is that failing test is pretty kind of human readable, and there's value there for other people, not just the developer. So I do that, and then I move inwards. So I've finished my kind of interpretation of the business requirements and my test that's going to work. And I move into my PHP spec. PHP spec is pretty much identical to what we're talking about with unit testing and PHP unit. This is PHP, as a developer, I'm testing the internal working of my application. So, it's a class, and it's got a method here which says it should dispatch a search for product lines for category parameters provided. And the reason why I put this up is because I just want to sort of demonstrate a couple of the bits that make PHP spec a slightly different approach to unit testing than PHP unit. I've not used it myself, but it's kind of set up in a way that you're kind of dealing with your application as sort of behaviour for that class, behaviour that it should be providing. So it should is pretty important. That's a sort of, as a developer, that's my mindset when I'm coming to write this code. What it also provides me, with mocks and stubs that I can pass straight in, and I can make very quick assertions that they're being used correctly. Now, the point is that the benefits to this are exactly the same as the benefits you get with PHP unit, refactoring and all that kind of stuff. But because you've started on the outside and you've come in, you already understand a little bit more about what you're going to try and deliver with this code. So, when you then run that, PHP spec is quite good because it's got some really good workflow in it. So, for example, I run my test for that search controller, and that index action I haven't actually written yet. So it actually asks me if I want to create it. So it's really good because it's got this kind of workflow that enables you, once you start getting involved in coding, it's quite quick for you to actually start developing your code, and it means that refactor cycle is pretty quick. So you're going to implement that logic, and then hopefully that test is going to pass. So that's the kind of approach in general. What are my thoughts on this and how I found it since I started doing it? Well, as I say, PHP spec versus PHP unit, sort of doing the same sort of thing in terms of the global kind of benefits you get out of using them. But PHP spec is quite good in the way that it allows you to mock objects really quickly, and you've got that sort of, it's always thinking about behaviour as opposed to thinking about kind of functional tests on like methods. If you look at a readout from a PHP spec, you've got things in here like it should pad the term with zeros, it should normalise composite SKUs. And you've got some of my behaviour in here, like it should dispatch the product lines for category parameters provided. But that's like developer friendly. That's really useful for developers. If I want to refactor my code, I've got all these lovely tests which are going to prevent me from breaking it. Not really useful to anybody else in that team, you know. It's just really good for me, and you should definitely have it. The thing about Behat is what it gives you. It gives you those business requirements are baked into your development effort. So from the outset, I've already interpreted what those requirements are. As soon as I start developing, I'm kind of already on the right lines. The interesting thing with Behat is that the test suite readouts aren't actually just interesting for developers. So if you have a look at this, this is a readout from our Behat test that are running on that site at the moment. And we had a new bit of functionality we put in, which was they wanted to search using wildcards, or they wanted to kind of correct search terms if people spelled product names wrong. So we've got some scenarios here, like user searches for a product line using a wildcard search, user searches for a product line name that spells it wrong. So you can see there they're all passing, but we've got this failing test here which says when they're searching for a product line, it's not actually working. Now, that's actually happening at the moment, it doesn't actually work. But the thing is, like, that's all right, because we got to the end of the sprint and we were like, should we deploy this to the client? You can actually say, well, these are all the things that aren't working, or these are things that are working, but the point is they can understand that and they can say, well, actually, yeah, I'm okay with that. You can deploy that if that's the only thing that's not working. The other good thing is they can read that and they can say, actually, I wasn't quite what I thought, but that's not quite the requirement. Because you've articulated that, hopefully you're already more in line, but they've got something they can read. Certainly a project manager can read to get a very, very quick view on how things are. So that's why that is very, very useful, not just for like developers. It's actually more useful for probably business guys and potentially project managers, product owners.
Yeah. Well, I had cue cards, but everybody's freestyled so far, so I'm going to try and run it. Okay, so basically Rob's explained what the process is on the back end. I'm going to try and attempt to explain what we are currently doing on the front end in terms of how we're testing this application, the code within it, and where it works quite well, and basically for what Rob spoke about earlier, where we can improve it and how we can sort of like where we can take it further. So, a bit of background before we jump into it. What we're using at the moment to test our application, we've got essentially what Rob's already said, that it's a backbone app in the middle of that website product finder. We're using Mocha as our framework for the tests. It's built on for Node and it runs in the browser, so it's quite flexible that way. It's quite modular, so we have to put some things together with it. Chai is our assertion library, which basically lets us write slightly more sort of verbose tests, so we can say this, expect this to contain, or expect this to equal, a bit more readable. Synon is our sort of like mocking and stubbing library, which we've already kind of covered what that sort of does. And then as part of our sort of build process, we run these tests through Grunt and then ultimately through Phantom.js, which is a headless web browser. So that sort of workflow works quite nicely, we found, and it's quite quick. So, bit of background. I joined this project probably about halfway through the development, so I can't take full credit for the development of it. But essentially, we had a requirement not too long ago to introduce a new feature. So at the moment, you saw Rob navigate through the product finder, and he hit a category, and it went straight to the product lines. In certain categories, we get this product family view, which is sort of another layer of filtering, which I'm going to try just in the same way that Rob. Yeah. So essentially, if I go into interior lighting, we get a sort of view here, the kind of all the categories and all the products within them. And if I go into spotlights, that's a good one. Yeah, we get this rather than getting the product lines, we get the product families. So if that's basically that. So how do we approach basically building this? As Rob mentioned, with our Agile approach, we obviously want to take the user story as the starting point, no matter who's involved in it, whether it be design front end or back end. Now you saw how Rob sort of worked his way through a user story, and from the stuff that we've been doing on the front end, we found the flow a little bit different, and I'm just going to kind of go through how we might sort of approach this. So if we try and take the sort of outside-in idea that we kind of want to assess what people are going to be seeing, and then worry about how we sort of support that a bit later on, we might look at a view. So we've got a backbone application at the moment which is throwing up sort of product families that are all grouped by brands. So the language is a bit loose here, but a UI test, probably not strictly academic, but what we've kind of got here is some tests that sort of let's say that when this view renders, we're going to have a group of brands that have the available families. So we do we render out the view, and then we inspect its HTML to find out whether those elements are in there. There's a step before this with all sort of like fixtures and stuff, but that's essentially what that's doing. So now we need to think about how we sort of support that view in terms of what else the application has to do. So we may move into a unit test, which I've learned from Luke's presentations may not strictly fit that criteria, but we're all learning. We've got a few things here that's sort of testing that the collection, so the backbone application has the idea of collection, which basically groups all the models together so that we can render out each one of these families. So this is kind of just checking that the collection has a URL on it, and a sort of example being that if it sort of calls the server, we're sort of mocking the response from the server with Synon to get that it's sort of populating the collection correctly and with the data that we sort of expect. That sort of workflow might not be how everybody's doing it, but if we look at how our tests sort of then sort of come out in the spec runner, might not be able to do that very well. But what we've kind of got is a bit of a mismatch in terms of we have things that are testing like specific methods on objects or certain functionality, and then other bits that are kind of inspecting layout or sort of behaviour in some places where we're actually rendering a view out and we're clicking things and seeing what's happening. So there's a little bit of a mixed match of things, and the value from that is perhaps not ideal. So this is where we're kind of looking to put some structure in our front end testing. So, sorry, back to the cue cards. So what are the benefits of our approach so far? We have got some major benefits in essence. With my experience from doing this, that I had a feature set, it's a spec suite, that was ran and built before I sort of started to work with this feature. So I had an assurance there that if I introduced any code into that, I had the assurance that what I'd done to it didn't break anything else. And that's kind of a bit of a given with a lot of that unit testing stuff and that side of things. We had a lot of this stuff in the backend applications about making requests to a web server and getting the sort of response back. Using things like Synon to sort of like mock responses, we could agree upon a result that we would get for then and mock that. And we didn't have the reliance on the back end to provide a feature for us to then test on the front end. And we've also looked at the tools like Hyslop, which is quite good at sort of returning a result from an endpoint without that actually existing. So I mean, as you've seen as I've walked through that, there are some sort of a lack of structure there and things that we can maybe improve. So what's kind of missing from our approach, I guess? The front-end tests don't support and align with the back-end, so all the good work that Rob's doing in terms of creating some very good behaviour-driven tests that he's ideally hoping that you can show to a client, that's only half of the story. We've got the front-end with some tests there that they don't marry up very well. We also have, so the business value of that I suppose is diminished because we can't show those tests to the client without having the front-end might not be working, even if the back-end is. We also have a missing step in terms of Rob had a very nice workflow there, going from a user story, taking that, putting it in a feature, sort of building some step definitions out of that and getting it sort of all working to it down. It's slightly more ambiguous for front end perhaps, in that we're not entirely sure where to start. The back end has a good flow, so can we not start to think about things in that sort of sense? So the back end's working quite well. And the front end needs to work well as well. We need to sort of harmonise.
Is that wrong?
I think it is.
Leave that up for a bit.
Not do it, yeah. No. So we've seen the value of the feature, the gherkin feature that Rob showed earlier on the back end, was what we could ideally do with is that on the front end if possible. And running with that, the back end and the front end could ideally share the same feature. And we could work out and flesh out scenarios that might be a bit more applicable to the front end and better to the back end, but ultimately when we're sort of building our tests out, they all kind of work towards the same feature file. So how can we do that? I mean, this is our approach at the moment. We've got Behat, which is doing some very good behavior stuff in the back end, and it's running back in the phpspec to flesh it all out. On the front end, we've kind of got Mocha, and this is our workflow. The other people might be doing things a bit differently, but at present, this is some of the challenges that we came across. So we've got Mocha basically running on its own, and it's trying to do everything. It's trying to do the more unit-based stuff, and it's trying to, where it can, sort of do something more behaviour. So we're lacking a bit of structure. So we had a bit of a think about what we could use to make this process a little bit more structured. Behat can essentially it could do both. It could sort of do the testing for the front end. It's perfectly capable of doing that, although I've not had any experience with it personally. But the difficulty here is that there is a dependency on the front end developer writing the front end tests in PHP, or the back end developer sort of doing that for them, or we have this sort of like friction where if there is back-end person who's writing some tests and the front-end person is trying to sort of write tests within that, it just didn't seem like a very clean approach. So in beta discovery, we can So an alternative, is we could use Mocha to do both. So we could kind of be very disciplined in our approach and kind of say, well, we're going to have two sort of test suites. One's going to test sort of behaviour, and the other test suite's going to sort of do the unit-based stuff. And what is potentially lacking there is the benefit of having this feature file. There are tools that will convert sort of gherkin files into sort of like Mocha step definitions of sort, but we just didn't feel like it was as clean as it could be. Behat is essentially like the BED side of things, and we needed something to sort of work quite well with that. In doing a bit of reading around Cucumber.js, which is I'd say relatively new, but it kind of does exactly what Behat does in the back end, whereby it's taking the feature and it is sort of converting it into step definitions, and we can sort of start to work using the same sort of things. So what is Cucumber what is it doing for us? If we were to use it, we would have benefits of a shared business language, same way that the backend's doing at the moment. We've now got a clear separation of sort of functional testing for the application and unit testing. So we've got a very clear separation of purposes there and what's going on. And moving forward with Cucumber, we've got, I mean, it is basically just a port of the Ruby sort of BED framework. So it's a very proven framework that would hopefully, obviously there's no guarantees, but this would hopefully be a good bet on moving forward with development. So potentially this is what it could look like. We've got, from a side project, we've got a feature file here where we want to be able to basically log into an application on the website and with the code, and the application will log us in. And the Behat side of things, we've got something fairly straightforward. This is where the priorities of what back end is testing and what front end is testing are slightly different. And this approach would allow for that. So we've got the same step, but the back end's doing one thing, it's testing whether the HTTP response is 200, and the front end is kind of doing a bit more sort of like functional testing, whereby it's testing the UIs. We're using Selenium to sort of to open that page, go into the login form, and some steps before that with the data, and we submit that form. And then we test. We have some expectations of what the next page will look like, and we've got some assertions there to sort of show that that is working. So this is kind of our end game, so to speak.
Yeah, it's a very practice segment. So yeah, I mean, what we're kind of trying to do here is we're trying to always start from that user story, and then like our Behat phpspec flow is pretty good, and it's the tooling which is given us that. You know, we're just using the tools for it, designed for, but you know, you couldn't do what we do without those two tools. And this looks to be a pretty similar approach that will give us the same sort of benefits and the same sort of workflow that we found very, very useful on the back end and on the front end. There are obviously challenges in doing that, which hopefully some people might ask me. And then after that, we've got this thing that we can show people. We've got these feature files we can sort of show. We've got lots of other value in these tests, and so we're kind of thinking about how we can take it forward using things like Jenkins and CI and all that sort of stuff to kind of really make the most out of this process and sort of give back to the client and the project as much as possible. So that's I think it is, right? Project-wise?
I think it is, yeah.
Yeah, so I suppose questions. Yeah.
Would you say that BBD is an extension of TDD, so it is the latest, newest thing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's like, TDD is like the concept of this idea of this test code refactor. And that is exactly the same philosophy. I suppose it's more like you're starting from a slightly sort of higher level. And business focus, and the tooling is designed to do just that. All it's designed to do is to allow you to interpret those business requirements and very quickly and like write some specs and tests. The point is, when you write, like Ryan showed you there, like with those step definitions, you only write them once, and you can then piece together different features. Look, I go to that page, I go to that page. It's very, very quick moving. So yeah, I think it's all obviously coming out of the same kind of thought process, but it's just this new way of doing it.
Using Cucumber.js, have you found yet that because it is a port of Cucumber in its infancy and it's a wrapper around Selenium and trying to wrap around a lot of Selenium's native methods, have you found yet any bottlenecks there yet, that methods that they haven't implemented yet, and that in terms of all the methods that Behat can implement when it's reading in a Gherkin spec and that Cucumber.js can?
Yeah, well, exactly. We haven't got too far with that approach, I suppose, but we have in getting up and running with it, we have encountered that it's not particularly mature. So there are issues where you couldn't just jump into that in the same way that you could jump into Behat and sort of start writing quite quickly. You are probably going to have trouble with the tooling at some point, which is a bit of a shame because it just kind of sort of restricts what you can do with it now. But I guess in terms of thinking about where we can take it, it seems like it could be a good fit.
Yeah, there are things in a Gherkin file, like a data table, right, which allows you to kind of load in a user, 1, user 2, user 3, that. It supports. So it supports those. So the Selenium thing, the Phantom thing, kind of that's a little bit separate to Cucumber really. And what we found is we've been experimenting with Zombie, Phantom, Selenium, and the problem is all got different APIs. And one of the things we want to do with this, with the front end stuff, is kind of we want to send these tests up to like Source Labs and Browser Stack so that we can test these tests in different browsers. And then suddenly your kind of cross-browser testing requirements really go away and you can automate it. The problem is, like, if you want to do that, you want to use Selenium. Selenium's slow, so you want to use Phantom on your desktop, but it's got a different API to Selenium. Phantom's quite good though, because the new version of Phantom's got Selenium built into it, so you can actually do like Phantom on your native node kind of command line on your dev tools, and then when you deploy to Jenkins, you can switch that around in config and say go and deploy out to this Selenium instance over here, and your code doesn't have to change. So we're kind of doing a little bit of discovery, aren't we? And it's been pretty tough, like some of it, because the documentation is like pretty ropey. The API inside is like error code 13, which is unknown error, all that sort of stuff. But it seems quite good, doesn't it? Like,
it's going to get better though, because the specific problem you said there was because they all have different APIs, and the W3C have just standardised a WebDriver API that the Phantom was one of the first people to use it.
yeah.
And when they all start using that, then you can have one runner that then can then use multiple different clients as its output.
Yeah.
But we're not at that point yet. But that will be the method. Yeah, that will be the
Have you ever had a scenario that you couldn't articulate in the Cucumber language? Too difficult.
Yeah, all the time. It's really hard. Yeah, there's an art to it. There's like real art to it, and I guess anyone that's been using it will attest to that. I mean, I guess someone that can interpret a business scenario and then write some code which kind of tests that perfectly is someone in your team you'd want to have. I was thinking about whether or not you could have like two people doing it. You could have someone writing Behat and someone writing the spec stuff, and that would be quite good. The problem is you do lose that if you've written the gherkin, you've written the Behat. That's articulation of the requirements that you've done. That person doesn't get. It's quite good for workflow. It's quite good for kind of doing two things at once. But you do lose that benefit of really understanding exactly what you're doing. You've always got like a step to go and have a look at to see exactly how it should be implementing. Yeah, it's pretty tough.
Is the end game sort of getting managers to be able to write the gherkin tests?
Oh yeah,
sort of separation.
Absolutely. But I think this is something Matt said to me the other day. It's like you kind of want to be confident as a developer that you can guide them through that, because it's new for us. It's like even newer for a business guy. I mean, did you write this file for me? Put it into a computer and it's going to like contest it. They're going to be like. So really, you've got to get there. And I think it's as developers you need to practice. And like that little project we did is our practice, our warm up to doing it for a client. You just got to keep doing more of it. I think then you can't get better.
Do you reckon you could get the clients to write those requirements in Gherkin?
Yeah. I think that's what it's designed for. That's if you read the blogs, you read all the stuff. They're like, this is what you're aiming for. But you've got to be able to hold their hand through that. I think.
Sure. Yeah.
And you kind of need that special client that will do it. I guess not all clients do it.
Yeah, because you do get some banter requirements from clients. So if they're like, they've got banter requirements, they'll write banter. You've got to hold that hand, I think.
Yeah, it would be quite nice to like, you've got your Jenkins there, and you've got at the end of the week, you've got your read out, and then the person can just look at that and say to the client, yeah, it's all working, we've broken this, but it's just that, so what do you want to do? Do you want us to deploy, or do you want us to deploy on Monday or Tuesday? And it's that kind of visibility of like, the application sort of doing all this stuff, but no one really, and the client's never going to be able to look at and see what the impact is to them. I mean, it's not even the client, it's some other person in the organisation which is actually that little bit of functionality as well. Kind of does expose all that.
It's interesting they said that you said that there was one broken feature in that, and you can still deploy it though, but if you're hooking up
we're not doing continuous deployment.
Yeah, because that would break the build and therefore it wouldn't be able to deploy. Would you put just an ignore flag on it? And then
don't know, probably. Yeah, because that's I guess the next step, like continuous deployment. So we're just trying to get to continuous integration. Like guys like you guys in bigger organisations probably have all that stuff going on.
slap an ignore flag, and that's why.
It's a one pretty override, don't you? It says like no, you can deploy.
Yeah.
Because we got 700 steps in that on that site, and do kind of go in and out bin.
Can you, for those of us that don't know, can you explain what a user story is properly? Like, what's it made up of?
It's all impossible one.
I don't know. You just didn't really go into it.
Oh, okay. I think a user story is this kind of it's a triple, if you like, of kind of identifying who the person is in the organisation this kind of requirement is relevant to. You're kind of identifying why it's relevant to them. Well, actually, let me start. The second point is you're identifying what the kind of function is. The third bit, which is really difficult, is like the why. And I'm Ryan, we kind of write a few there, but we don't really have the why. It's quite tricky to work it out. Unless you get your client involved right at the beginning, then you're not going to be able to capture that. So it's like who the person is, what they're doing, what the function is they're using, which is the easy bit hopefully, and then like why they need that. And the why they need that is,
It's a good way of justifying features because you often ask a client, well, why do you want that user story? Put the why on the end of it, and they can't do it. So it's the pointless user story. They can't justify why they want it.
The tricky thing is,
it's a really good way of making a lean application. It's always justifying everything you do.
yeah, exactly. Well, the tricky thing is you've got to be practical about the way you write those features, because we have those filters, right? And there's like about 20 of them. And we do really want to test each one in isolation, but we don't want the client to be like writing this user story, this one I can filter by shape, I can filter by so and so, I can filter by this and this. So you kind of have to work out the best use of your time. You don't want to test everything, but as a sort of developer, you know what these requirements are you need to collect and how you kind of articulate them into those user stories.
How does it translate to kind of non-user driven kind of business services?
Well, pretty well, to be honest. Like, this is just like a little personal project, but I've written a little command line tool. Actually, no, I can scrap that personal project, we've done it on here. So on that website, we've got an API that we call, it is a SOAP API, and it's like horrendous, but that's how we load all the products in. ASP as well, so thanks very much. So we've got this SOAP API, and we wrote a command line tool, it's a Symfony command line tool to put it in. So instead of that, on that step definition, instead of having I visit this browser, I can, with Symfony, with Behat, I can say when I run this command. And then we can use Robo Hydra, which is that thing that Ryan mentioned, to mock that SOAP request and put in. So when that returns a 404, when that returns a product without this node, what do we do? And so it's quite good. This is really just kind of it's that end-to-end approach. Doesn't really have to be restricted to web browser or web case. It's just that sort of starting there and moving inwards.
Cool.
So it's pretty good, to be honest. Like if you get into it, you kind of notice that you can use it for different things.
Based on Patrick's point, I think the most important thing I found recently for kind of the Agile approach and the user story is the acceptance criteria. As you mentioned, it would be lovely to have someone that could write the user story and then translate it to your unit tests.
Yeah.
And for me, that the gap is filled by the acceptance criteria.
Yeah.
Because in ours, like the business might want one thing, they might write a user story, and then I interpret it as a completely different thing.
Mm-hmm.
But just having 5 points that say, I expect to see this come out, this come out, this come out. That's what really helps.
So do you have a team? Is it a team that do that?
Well, we have like what we call like a team or a cell. They'll be working on one product, and there'll be a product owner that interprets what the business want. And they might write it from a very high level, like, as a user I want to fill those products. But just to make sure there's not that misunderstanding of what the business want and the developer think the business want, there's a very defined acceptance criteria there. Unless these are the things that come back, that ticket doesn't pass.
So like you filter by this, but if you filter by that thing, you shouldn't get this bit.
Remember
that product, that one isn't available in this brand, things like that.
It helps that misunderstanding.
Because they would go directly into that feature file and then as a developer you just like, thanks very much.
Yeah.